$800 billion. That is not the cost of a future war. That is the invoice for the one already underway. Right now, Washington and Beijing are burning through wealth at a pace that makes the Cold War look like a budget dispute. And the battlefield is not some distant ocean or contested airspace. It is the bond market, the semiconductor fab, and the shipping container. It is the price tag on your groceries and the interest rate on your mortgage. For 3 decades, the global economy ran on a handshake between two superpowers. America bought, China built. Inflation stayed quiet in the West. Poverty retreated in the East. Economists gave it a name, Chimerica, and treated it like a law of nature. It was never a law. It was a deal. And the deal is dead. The evidence is everywhere once you know where to look. Foreign direct investment flowing into China has cratered to levels the world has not seen since the early 90s. American corporations are executing what they politely call a China plus one strategy, a diplomatic way of saying industrial evacuation. Wall Street risk models now carry a line item that did not exist 5 years ago. The probability that assets held inside China simply vanish overnight if a military flashpoint ignites in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. This is not geopolitical speculation. It is an actuarial math. And the numbers say the divorce between the two largest economies on Earth is accelerating, messy, and staggeringly expensive. When you stack up the military outlays, the supply chain reconstruction, the industrial subsidies, and the lost efficiency from duplicating an entire global production system, the running tab approaches $1 trillion a year in value destroyed. That figure is not a projection. It is the current cost of containment. We are witnessing something that has no modern precedent, the deliberate weaponization of the US dollar against the nation that holds more of America's debt than almost anyone else on Earth. The entire architecture of global finance is being stress tested in real time, and the cracks are spreading faster than the engineers can patch them. To understand how two nations that once needed each other for survival are now engineering each other's pain, we need to trace the fracture back to where it started, to the decisions, the miscalculations, and the structural fault lines that turned a partnership into a collision course. The architecture of this conflict was laid not in a war room, but in a factory. For decades, China operated as the workshop of the planet, producing goods at a scale and cost that no other nation could match. American consumers benefited from relentlessly falling prices on electronics, clothing, and household goods. Chinese workers benefited from wages that lifted entire generations out of subsistence farming. The arrangement felt permanent. It was anything but. The fracture accelerated when Beijing made a strategic pivot. The old model, build cheap, export volume, had run its course. Chinese leadership recognized that a nation dependent on assembling other people, as inventions, would always be subordinate to the nations that designed them. So the directive changed. China would climb the value chain, not by gradual evolution, but by state-directed industrial force. Electric vehicles, advanced batteries, solar panels, and semiconductors became national priorities funded with hundreds of billions in government-backed credit. Washington watched this transformation with growing alarm. The CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act together represent the most aggressive industrial policy the United States has pursued since the Second World War. Hundreds of billions allocated to reshoring critical manufacturing. The era of letting the market decide which industries live and die on American soil is over. National security now dictates which factories get built, which supply chains get subsidized, and which foreign competitors get locked out. The semiconductor became the fulcrum of the entire struggle. Advanced chips power everything from artificial intelligence to precision weapon systems. By restricting the export of cutting-edge processors from NVIDIA and AMD to Chinese buyers, Washington drew a technological red line. The goal is explicit: freeze China's AI capabilities at their current generation. It is, in strategic terms, the 21st century equivalent of an oil embargo. If you are finding the pattern here, if the logic of this escalation is clicking into place, subscribe and hit like, because what comes next reveals why this contest is no longer containable to boardrooms and trade negotiations. China's response has been calculated and asymmetric. Unable to access the most advanced chip-making tools, Beijing redirected its resources toward dominating the legacy semiconductor market, the older generation chips that run automobiles, appliances, industrial equipment, and guided munitions. Flood the world with cheap legacy chips, drive Western manufacturers out of business, and suddenly China holds a choke point over the supply chain that is every bit as powerful as the one Washington tried to impose on them. Two nations, each reaching for the other's throat through the circuitry of the modern world. Behind the headline, tensions, lies a deeper crisis that Beijing is desperate to conceal. The Chinese property sector, once the single largest asset class in human history, responsible for roughly 30% of national economic output, has entered a state of controlled collapse. The implosions of developers like Evergrande and Country Garden did not just erase corporate balance sheets. They incinerated the primary savings vehicle of hundreds of millions of Chinese households. The wealth destruction is generational, and domestic consumer spending has cratered as a direct result. This is where the external aggression and the internal fragility become inseparable. A government facing a devastated consumer base has exactly one option to maintain economic growth and social stability: export its way out. Beijing has turned its subsidized factories into an industrial fire hose, spraying electric vehicles, solar panels, and manufactured goods onto global markets at prices that undercut every Western competitor. This is not ordinary trade competition. It is state-sponsored overcapacity engineered to crush rivals by selling below the cost of production for as long as necessary. The flood is already hitting shores. European automakers are scrambling. American manufacturers in the Rust Belt are watching their margins evaporate. BYD has overtaken Tesla as the world's largest electric vehicle producer, building cars that are technologically competitive and roughly 30% cheaper. The political pressure for retaliation is becoming irresistible. Section 301 investigations into Chinese shipbuilding, logistics, and green energy are the bureaucratic prelude to tariffs that could exceed 100% on targeted goods. But China holds cards of its own, and each one is designed to inflict maximum pain. Nearly 90% of the world's rare earth processing runs through Chinese facilities, elements essential to everything from fighter jets to smartphone batteries. A significant share of active pharmaceutical ingredients for American generic drugs originates in Chinese chemical plants. And then there is the financial card, the one that keeps Treasury officials awake at night. Roughly $800 billion in U.S. government bonds sitting on the balance sheet of the People's Bank of China. For years, that mountain of debt was the glue binding the two economies together. China recycled its trade surplus into American bonds, keeping U.S. interest rates artificially low and fueling the housing boom. That cycle has reversed. China is now a systematic seller, offloading billions in treasuries month after month, using the proceeds to stockpile gold at a pace that has startled the World Gold Council. They are replacing paper obligations from Washington with the one asset that carries zero counterparty risk. Everything we have covered so far is the setup. The consequences rippling outward from this fracture are where this story becomes personal. Here is what the decoupling adds up to in terms you can feel. The 3-decade subsidy that Chinese manufacturing provided to the American consumer, the force that kept flat screens cheap, sneakers affordable, and inflation invisible, is being permanently withdrawn. What replaces it is a resilience premium. The cost of building 2 parallel supply chains where one used to suffice, of paying Vietnamese and Mexican wages that are structurally higher than Chinese ones, of holding more inventory building redundant factories, and absorbing geopolitical risk into every price tag. The era of 2% baseline inflation is gone. The new floor is closer to 3 or 4%, compounding year after year, eroding purchasing power at double the pace Americans grew accustomed to. This is the invisible tariff of decoupling, levied not by Congress, but by the physics of fragmenting the most integrated production system ever constructed. The housing market is collateral damage. As China steps back from buying U.S. treasuries, upward pressure on yields keeps mortgage rates elevated. Homeowners locked in at 3% refuse to sell, strangling inventory. Prices remain stubbornly high, even as affordability collapses. It is a stagflationary trap, frozen volume, elevated cost, and an industry that constitutes nearly a fifth of the American economy grinding toward a deep freeze. Here's the question I keep returning to. If the stabilizing buyer of American debt has become a strategic seller, and if the fiscal deficit is running at $2 trillion a year during what is nominally peacetime, who absorbs the bonds? The answer is the domestic saver and, ultimately, the Federal Reserve, a classic marker of a late-stage imperial economy financing a rivalry it cannot afford to lose. Tell me in the comments whether you think that trajectory is sustainable, because the historical precedents are not encouraging. Meanwhile, the currency war is advancing beneath the surface. China is promoting renminbi-denominated trade settlement with Russia, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. The digital yuan is designed to bypass the SWIFT banking network entirely. Central banks globally are accumulating gold at the fastest rate in half a century. A quiet referendum on dollar confidence. The reserve currency will not lose its status overnight, but the shift toward a multipolar monetary system is no longer theoretical. It is underway, and every percentage point of global trade that migrates away from the dollar narrows Washington's ability to finance its deficits through the privilege of printing the world as money. So here is the landscape as it actually stands, stripped of political theater and market euphoria. Two economies that spent 30 years fusing together are now tearing apart, and the friction generates heat in every direction. Higher consumer prices, elevated borrowing costs, compressed corporate margins. A defense budget that is no longer cyclical but secular, driven by a global rearmament cycle stretching into the next decade. Interest payments on the national debt are on pace to exceed the Pentagon's budget this fiscal year. The math does not resolve cleanly, and Washington is choosing inflation over austerity to paper over the gap. China, for its part, faces its own structural vice. A demographic crisis is tightening. The workforce is shrinking, the population is aging, and the window to achieve high income status before the demographic dividend expires is closing fast. Energy dependence remains acute. 70% of Chinese oil arrives through sea lanes that a naval blockade could sever. The desperate push into solar, wind, and battery technology is not primarily an environmental project. It is a survival strategy to break free from an energy supply chain that an adversary controls. The irony is thick enough to cut. America needs Chinese solar panels to meet its climate commitments. China needs Western semiconductor tools to advance its AI ambitions. Each nation is reaching for self-sufficiency in the exact domain where the other holds leverage. The result is a policy contradiction that neither government can resolve without accepting a cost it is unwilling to pay. For anyone watching this and wondering what it means for their own financial position, the takeaway is structural, not tactical. Passive allocation to a broad index fund now carries embedded geopolitical risk that the last 3 decades never demanded you price in. The companies in your portfolio are on the front lines of a conflict that can vaporize revenue streams overnight. Ask any analyst modeling Apple, is China exposure or Tesla's Shanghai dependency? Cash-flowing businesses with pricing power and tangible assets outperform promises in an inflationary regime. Energy, defense, critical minerals, and domestic infrastructure are the sectors aligned with the direction of history, not against it. We opened with a number, $800 billion. That figure was the down payment. The full invoice for this rivalry will be measured in trillions over the coming decade, reshaping what it means to hold wealth, to run a business, and to plan a retirement. The partnership that kept the world cheap and stable is over. What replaces it is more volatile, more expensive, and more honest about the costs that were always hidden in the fine print. The empire is not falling, it is restructuring, and the only advantage that matters now is seeing the blueprint while the walls are still moving.